like we kind of like can't do this and not mention Jack Hayford.
Right. Yeah.
And the song Majesty that we recorded there at Liberty, the first time I recorded that song was on the very first. So in other words, All Hail King Jesus that you played was actually three.
Yeah.
That initial #1 album that they picked up while it was still a magazine. I was kind of trying to convince my pastor that we should maybe record these and distribute these cassettes, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, he was like, not so sure. So right about that time, I had convinced him to go out with me to California to this kind of worship conference thing, and it was where Jack Hayford was introducing the song Majesty, and he had kind of built a musical around it. And, you know, the band is like Michael Amardian and
yeah.
Abe Laboriel and, you know, all these guys who would go on to be like, you know, the core of my band. Chester Thompson was there on drums, and Alex Acuna and Justo Mario, and you know, the bunch of the singers who ended up doing, you know, 100 albums with me. But okay, so we hear the song Majesty, and it's kind of like, okay, these people don't know me from Adam, but like I'm like, you know, walk down to the front guy, you know, and I'm just walking down there and saying, excuse me, you know, we're from St. Louis, and you know, we really feel God's doing something to worship in our church. You know, could we just talk to you for a minute? To Jack Hayford, right? And he stopped what he was doing. Now this is, you know, bazillion people all over the place. And you know, he stops what he's doing to talk to us, and up from behind a gobo comes, you know, this huge smiling face of Abe Laboriel, and it's like Jack said, you know what? I'd really like for you guys to come to my office tomorrow at 10 o'clock. And it was the most incredible, you know, I'd never met the man before, but you talk about a guy who's influenced the world of worship. Jack Hayford's just an amazing individual, and he's still an amazing individual. But, you know, basically, he was sort of like the rocket fuel. So we went back and recorded that album that became Hosanna 1. And I sort of did, you know, my first arrangement of his song, of Majesty, on that album. And then came back around when we were at Liberty, however many years later, and did it again with Ron.
Wow.
But Jack Hayford is like one of the pillars of the modern worship music, as far as the modern worship movement, as far as I'm concerned.
I can remember about 12 years ago when I started my first degree in theology. I can remember taking a worship class, and one of the texts was "Worship His Majesty," the book that he wrote by Jack Hayford.
Oh, yeah. Right.
I can remember wearing out a highlighter, just going through page after page after page, and just, man, he says it better than I could ever say it. And it still
just paint that book.
Exactly, paint the book, and it still sits on my bookshelf as kind of, you know, one of the classics really on contemporary worship and worship ministry. If you were to put a year on those albums that were done at Liberty, what would you guess, ballpark?
Wow. You know, it's funny. One thing that is pretty fuzzy for me is just the chronology in terms of years. I could tell you the sequence in terms of the albums, but I don't think I looked at a calendar for about 18 years. And that would have been, what, kind of mid-90s, maybe?
That sounds about right. About right.
Yeah, I'd have to look at that one. There's a plaque of it down the hall there that's wrapped up in a box. I could check.
You got all this nostalgia around you. It's pretty neat. Tell me, Tom, how did you go about choosing the worship leaders and the congregations for these projects? You know, the whole 8-week thing. You're obviously, you know, by the time you get one finished, you got to have the next 2 lined up. Like, tell me how that was decided upon.
Yeah, it was. Our cycle was pretty funny. So in the middle of the 8 weeks, the guys would come to my place in St. Louis, and we pretty much had like a 3-day or 4-day meeting, almost like an all-week meeting. And like day one was the guys would basically check the mix that I had just finished of the previous album. So, you know, they would go through and literally sit in the back of my studio with pads, you know, and kind of make notes of, you know, this line could be a little louder, I couldn't really understand that word, you know, and these sort of notes, so that I would finalize one album on the first day. the second day, we would meet with the worship leader that would be the next album. So in other words, 4 weeks from now. So the second day was making the final preparations to go and do that live remote that was coming up. So that'd be final song list. Do we have everything in place? Is the budget lined up? Do we have the record truck? Then the third day, we would typically meet with one, maybe two or three worship leaders. But if it was one, it was the guy that we're thinking of, not for the next album, but for the next one.
Gotcha.
So that was a very key day, because if we had one guy and it turned out that he wasn't the one, or maybe his schedule didn't work out, then we were a little bit desperate, And then the fourth day, if we had a fourth day, it was probably like we would have days where we would literally listen to 100 songs. And, everybody would come, and I've got my 20 that I've collected over the last 4 weeks, and, Mike's got his, and Don's got his, and Garrett's got his. And so sometimes we would plow through 100 songs in a day. But that kind of cycle kept us moving forward. But typically where the worship leaders came from, it was all just like God networking. We would go to a conference and meet a guy, and people that passed through my church. Initially Don Malone was just a traveling piano player for Terry Law, who was basically a kind of an evangelist guy. Ron Canoli, we met through a connection with his pastor. Several guys were from Christ for the Nations. Great guys, Marty Nystrom, David Butterbaugh. I was using Kelly Willard, who I met through Maranatha, and she kept gnawing at me, you gotta listen to this guy that's working for me, Paul Balash, I think he's really got something there. And we would all say, sure, Kelly, whatever, And, Paul turned into probably the most prolific songwriter that Integrity ever worked with.
Did you do the He Is Faithful album, the first one that he did?
Yeah, I produced his first album, and Paul is still a great friend, man. I mean, he is one of the best one of my favorite worship leaders. I would say he's one of the premier worship leaders on the planet today. I love his phrase. He keeps telling worship leaders when we do conferences that you need to think of worship as the un-concert. Like 7-Up is the un-cola. This is the un-concert. Don't try to make this into a rock show. Sit, however big your church is, sit down like you're with your family in your living room and your friends, and just strum your guitar and let's seek God together. He's the guy that really has that down.
I love that. I've been privileged to do a couple of conferences with him, and he actually regularly
awesome.
Skypes into my students and speaks in my composition class. And talk about a guy who's the real deal, like through and through. Love that.
Another great one, Tommy Walker.
Yes.
Have you spent the time with Tommy?
I don't know him personally, but he's been at Thomas Road a number of times, and he's a very good friend of our worship pastor, Charles Billingsley. I know Charles has co-wrote with him a number of times.
Yeah. Charles, there's another guy. I love Charles. Well, actually, that thing we were at in Miami, Tommy was there, right?
Yes, that's right.
When we were together there a couple months ago.
That's exactly right.
Tommy's another great songwriter. Now, Tommy, Abraham, the bass player I was telling you about, that we met at that first conference, we were working on some project, and we just finished at Schnee's studio there in Hollywood, and he said, there's a night of worship at this church that I've heard about. We should just stop by there. And so literally, he and I are in the parking lot, and we hear this guy, Tommy, singing, "You've turned my morning,
right?
Yeah, dancing again." And so we met Tommy through that, and of course he's an awesome songwriter. We ended up using that song to lift him up. And there's plenty of great guys, but really the way we met all those worship leaders was just God kind of like connecting this network. And It's still really the way. God's way more efficient when it comes to relationships than Facebook or Twitter or anything
Absolutely.
else.
Well, I even think of the way that we were able to connect at that conference, and just your graciousness and
Yeah.
willingness to talk to a young buck like me, and that's certainly appreciated. Now, help clarify with me a perception that I think some people may have of integrity in relation to the songs that were chosen, and to the worship leaders, and to the presentation of the music that you worked on. I
Okay.
think some people would say, in terms of the evangelical landscape of America, that integrity would be more bent towards a charismatic expression. Would you agree or disagree with that, or could you cite, obviously, was this on the mind when you guys were producing albums, or obviously it was a reflection of who you guys were and your
Yeah.
your expression, but tell me what role that had and what your perception of things were.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that anybody was really trying to do anything. If it seems like as soon as human nature loves to put terms on stuff, right?
Right.
Because they love to be able to categorize and you're this type of thing and you're this type of thing, and well, that's that type of music and that's this type of music. I don't think that God really does that. I think He sees individuals. So, but if you take a term like charismatic, it's like to be able to respond to something like that, you really have to define, well, what do you mean by that?
Mm-hmm.
I'm in Saddleback Church, which Pastor Rick is a Baptist seminary trained guy, but the gifts of the Spirit, if that's what's tied to that term charismatic, I mean. I think the gifts of the Spirit flow in a lot of ways that aren't necessarily what people think of as, oh, well, if you're charismatic, you have to, swing from chandeliers and jump pews and speak in tongues. I think the enemy is really crafty in that if he can't turn us into like drug addicts or gamblers or whatever, he'll get us on something that we're really excited about and like have us chase it like right off that cliff,
Right.
And I think some people they take those terms and they really, out of zeal or whatever it is, they sort of let the enemy just like take them off a cliff. To me, we were just responding as excited baby Christians. That's all we were doing. And, out of excitement, and most of the places we went, were the same kind of excited people. And, these nights that we put on, these nights were exciting, man, and people came anticipating a move of God. So, a lot of really exciting stuff happened. So, if that is considered charismatic, yeah, I suppose.
Do you think the music of integrity though served a broad platform in terms of different people on the spectrum, those coming from a liturgical background, those coming from a more balanced background, or maybe even a Baptist background? Not to say that Baptists are the only ones that are balanced, and then those, of course, that maybe came from a more expressive background. Do you think that integrity music had a wide appeal and a wide application in terms of what they offered the church?
Yeah, well, I think it did have a wide appeal because, I think there weren't elements in it that caused Baptists to say, well, we can't do this.
Right.
There were a lot of, but at the same time, there were a lot of, we go in these African churches, which I think, I assume, our definition of charismatic is probably pretty similar, that would be off the hook charismatic churches. And they can use those tools, and they can, jump over pews and swing from chandeliers and just, these 750,000 people where we were, that space, this was outdoors, was absolutely lit up. It would probably pretty much nail any definition of charismatic that anybody would want to have. It was an 11-hour dance party for Jesus. It's pretty much off the hook. But at the same time, a lot of those song tools that Integrity did provide, Baptists embraced, and they found a place that, they had no problem with it. So in that sense, I do like the fact that it was pretty broad. Now, it wasn't like we tried to be broad. That was kind of just that's what God put in our hands, so that's what we ran with. But I love anything that brings the church together. I love anything that helps people find God.